At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than another controlled, professional sit-down, the kind of format boxing fans have seen many times before, where two fighters are brought together to talk, reflect, and present a version of themselves that fits within the expectations of the moment. But sometimes those expectations create a kind of pressure that reveals more than it hides. And from the very beginning of this Gloves Off episode featuring David Benavidez and Zurdo Ramirez, there was a subtle indication that something beneath the surface wasn't entirely as calm as it appeared, because even before the conversation found its rhythm, there was an awareness in the room that this wasn't just about words, it was about presence, about positioning, and about two fighters quietly measuring each other in a space where everything is seen, even the things that aren't openly expressed. David Benavidez carried himself with the kind of intensity that doesn't need to be exaggerated to be felt, a steady, grounded confidence that comes from experience, from knowing exactly what he brings into a fight and what he expects from anyone standing across from him, and that confidence showed itself not through loud statements or aggressive gestures, but through consistency, in the way he answered questions, in the way he maintained eye contact, and in the way he allowed silence to exist. Without rushing to fill it, creating a presence that felt controlled but undeniably strong. Zurdo Ramirez, in contrast, brought a slightly different energy, one that balanced calmness with a quiet sense of determination, as if he was fully aware of the moment but chose to approach it on his own terms, not reacting too quickly, not overextending himself in conversation, but instead allowing his words to come with intention, and that approach created a dynamic where neither fighter was trying to dominate the conversation in an obvious way, yet both were clearly engaged in something deeper than a simple exchange of answers. As the conversation began, everything followed the expected structure, with both fighters speaking respectfully, acknowledging each other's abilities, and maintaining a tone that felt professional and composed. But within that structure, there were small moments that hinted at something more, slight pauses before certain responses, subtle shifts in posture, and changes in tone that suggested that not everything being thought was being said. And it's in those moments that the real story often begins to take shape. One of the most interesting aspects of the interaction was how both fighters seemed to understand the balance they needed to maintain, because while there was respect, there was also competition, and managing both at the same time requires a level of awareness that goes beyond casual conversation, as each response had to acknowledge the other without giving away too much, creating a kind of verbal tension where every statement felt measured, almost strategic in the way it was delivered. As the conversation moved forward, the tone began to shift in a way that wasn't immediately obvious but became more noticeable the longer it continued, because what started as a controlled exchange slowly developed into something more layered, where each answer carried a subtle edge that hadn't been present at the beginning, and this shift didn't come from direct confrontation or obvious disagreement, but from the way both fighters started to frame their responses, choosing words that sounded respectful on the surface while quietly reinforcing their own position, their own confidence, and their own belief that they held the advantage. And that kind of communication creates a tension that is easy to miss if you're not paying attention, but once you recognize it, it changes the entire tone of the conversation. There was a moment where a question about fighting style created an unexpected level of intensity, because instead of giving simple, descriptive answers, both Benavidez and Zurdo approached it as an opportunity to define not just how they fight, but how they see themselves in comparison to each other, and that comparison, even though it wasn't stated directly, became the underlying focus of their responses, as each fighter emphasized strengths that subtly challenged the other, creating a situation where the conversation felt less like an exchange of information and more like a quiet contest of positioning, where every word served a purpose beyond its immediate meaning. Benavidez, known for his pressure and physical presence, spoke with a level of certainty that suggested he wasn't just confident in his abilities, but convinced of them, and that conviction came through in the way he described his approach, not as something that could be matched, but as something that would inevitably impose itself on anyone in front of him. And while he didn't say it directly, the implication was clear, and it added a layer of tension to the moment because it challenged Zurdo without requiring a direct confrontation. Zurdo's response to that implied challenge was equally controlled, but carried its own kind of intensity, because instead of pushing back aggressively, he maintained a calm tone while subtly reinforcing his own strengths, presenting himself as someone who couldn't be easily pressured or overwhelmed. And that contrast between Benavidez's forward confidence and Zurdo's composed resistance created a dynamic where neither fighter gave ground, even though neither of them raised their voice or stepped outside the boundaries of the conversation. What made this exchange particularly compelling was the way it unfolded without ever breaking the surface of professionalism, because everything remained technically respectful, yet the meaning behind the words suggested something much more competitive, almost as if both fighters were speaking in a language that only they fully understood, where the real message existed beneath the literal interpretation, and that kind of layered communication is often where the most interesting moments in combat sports begin to develop. As the episode continued, there were brief moments where the tension seemed to ease, where the conversation returned to a more relaxed tone, allowing both fighters to step back from the intensity that had begun to build, but those moments never lasted long, because the underlying dynamic remained unchanged, and it only took a single question or a slight shift in topic for that tension to rise again, creating a rhythm that kept the conversation feeling unpredictable, even though it never became openly confrontational. There was also a noticeable awareness from both fighters that this moment was being watched closely, not just by fans, but by analysts, promoters, and potentially even future opponents, and that awareness influenced the way they carried themselves, the way they spoke, and the way they responded to each other, because in a setting like this, perception matters just as much as reality, and both Benavidez and Zurdo seemed fully aware that every detail of this interaction could shape how they are viewed moving forward. At one point, there was a subtle pause that lasted just a little longer than expected, a moment where neither fighter spoke immediately, and in that silence, the tension became almost tangible, because it felt like both were waiting, not for the next question, but for the other to reveal something, to say something that could shift the balance of the conversation, and when that didn't happen, the silence itself became part of the exchange, reinforcing the idea that this wasn't just about words, but about control. What made the situation feel even more intense was the realization that both fighters were operating with a high level of discipline, choosing not to let the moment escalate, even when there were opportunities to do so, and that restraint suggested a deeper level of focus, as if both understood that the real battle wasn't happening in that room, but could be shaped by what happened there, and that understanding kept everything contained while still allowing the tension to exist. As the conversation moved closer to its later stages, there was a noticeable shift toward reflection, with both fighters speaking more about their journeys, their experiences, and what has brought them to this point, but even within those more personal responses, the underlying competitive element remained present, because every story, every detail, and every reflection carried an implicit message about who they are and what they represent as fighters. By this point, it had become clear that what seemed like a simple conversation on the surface was actually a complex interaction shaped by multiple layers of intention, awareness, and subtle competition, where both fighters were carefully balancing respect with self-assertion, creating a dynamic that felt far more intense than the format would normally suggest. For viewers who were expecting obvious drama, this episode may not have delivered it in the traditional sense, but for those who understood what was happening beneath the surface, it offered something more interesting, a look at how high-level fighters engage with each other psychologically, even in environments that are designed to remain controlled. And that's what made this moment stand out, because instead of relying on loud exchanges or dramatic confrontations, it built tension through subtlety, through the accumulation of small details that, when viewed together, created a sense of something much larger taking place. By the time the conversation came to an end, there was no dramatic conclusion, no final statement that defined the interaction, but there was a clear sense that something had been established, something that could carry forward into future discussions, future matchups, and future moments between these two fighters. Because in the end, the most powerful part of this gloves-off episode wasn't what was said directly, but what existed beneath the surface, in the tension, in the restraint, and in the unspoken understanding between two fighters who know exactly what they bring into a fight, and who, even in a calm conversation, couldn't completely hide the fact that when the time comes, this won't just be another matchup. It will be something far more intense, far more personal, and far more difficult than it appears.